All right, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican pre-classic or formative cultures. We're going to talk about the Olmec, a little bit about the Zapotec, not much about the Zapotec, and a little bit about Teotihuacan. And next time we'll talk about the Maya. So, an introduction to Mesoamerican geography. There's essentially three zones of major civilization in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica just means Middle America, so it's this chunk in between what we would normally call Central America, in between South America and North America, although a lot of this happens technically in North America. So the first region is this. This is the Mexican Basin and Highlands. This is a semi-arid region, and this is where we're going to find the Toltecs, Teotihuacan. This is also where we're going to find the Aztecs, Nahuatl speakers, Mixtec, etc., Tlaxcalans, a whole bunch of different cultures that are up in this. This is an endorheic region. It means that it has a lot of pluvial lakes, that's rain-gathering lakes, but it's pretty much semi-arid. Then we have the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast is where we find the Olmec. The Olmec are the oldest Mesoamerican civilization. We used to think they were the oldest civilization in the New World. We now know that Norte Chico down in Peru is much older. But this is a very lush coastal rainforest. This is the regions of the Veracruz and Tabasco coasts, and this is where we find the Olmec. And then finally we have the Mayan zone, and the Mayan zone is one of the largest and one of the more diverse of the areas. It includes all of the Yucatan Peninsula, and then it also includes the highlands, which is of course these regions in Guatemala, Honduras, etc. And there's a lot of diversity in that group as well. We'll talk more about the Maya there. But these are the three principal areas. It's also important to note that there's lots of other things going on. We have Monte Albán out here, which is Zapotec. It's also very early, and it's in Oaxaca areas. But we still have mostly concentrated in these three areas. When we talk about Mesoamerican chronology, it's going to be very similar to South American chronology, except instead of using the fancy hoity-toity horizon, we call it classic. So the earliest period of New World archaeology, the thing that people really concentrated on, was the Mayan stuff. And so the high point was decided that was the high point. And whether that was the high point in the view of the natives or not, who knows? But that's what we called it. So we called that the classic period. And by logical inference, anything before that's going to be pre-classic. Anything after that is going to be post-classic. So the Olmec, the Zapotec, they're going to be, you know, pre-classic or formative civilizations. And then as we get into the early classic period, we're going to get Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan crosses over from the formative into the early classic. But of course, the classic civilization is the Maya. And then we have a kind of terminal classic Maya, which is very late classic Maya. And then we get into the post-classic period, where we have these later developments. This is where we're going to get Aztecs, Toltecs, etc. So there you can see how it more or less breaks down. Let's talk about the Olmec. So the Olmec are some of the earliest groups out there. The second oldest, probably after Chico Norte, which isn't on this because we only, this thing was made in 2002 and they didn't even start excavating Chico Norte until 2003. So the major sites of the Olmec are going to be along the Veracruz and Tabasco coast. They're going to be places like La Venta and San Lorenzo. We'll take a little bit at their imagery, we'll take a look at their writing, and some of the first evidences of pyramids and some of the culture that begins there. The Olmec are often referred to as the Ur culture or mother culture of all Mesoamerican civilizations. There's a lot of things: jaguar imagery, maize and rain deities, sky dragons, Jade, Greenstone. All of these things seem to originate with the Olmec, and so that's why we often think that maybe they are the foundational civilization for all these other cultures. It's important to know that for the longest time we didn't even know the Olmec were there. In fact, we have no idea what the Olmec called themselves. They do have writing, but we can't read any of it. So unfortunately, we have no idea what they called themselves or what they called their gods. So we come up with lots of creative names. And Olmec is actually a Nahuatl word that just means people of the land of the rubber trees. And that's accurate since this is a place where anciently rubber was cultivated. So they're some of the first people to actually build pyramids and platforms. Some of these are not in very great shape today. This is La Venta. This is probably the most significant of these. Here's a possible reconstruction of it. These were always earthen mounds, but in some places they were kind of formalized with stone and masonry. One of the things we'll notice as we go forward in Mesoamerican archaeology is we'll start to see some of the same forms again and again. For example, you will often see low platforms with a platform on either side and an area in the center for kind of performance in that regard. Pyramids become places to put temples. These are, again, elevating temples and sacred places above the mundane plane. Located in and around these platforms, Matthew Stirling, the archaeologist, discovered a number of artifacts, and in fact, we only know most of the Olmec artifacts from the 1930s and later. A few of these have been discovered earlier, but most of them have been uncovered since the 1930s. So for such an ancient civilization, again, it's only a relatively new discovery. Of course, the absolute identifying characteristic of the Olmec are these Olmec heads. These things, again, there's 17 of these, colossal heads. They weigh between 2 and 6 tons. The smallest are about 1.5 meters tall. The largest are 2.5 meters tall. And they all have these characteristically broad faces, broad noses and features and characteristics. They all wear helmets or headdresses of some kind. It's possible that these might be ball gear. We'll talk more about ball games and the Mesoamerican sphere and why they're so important. So that's some of the evidence of, that they were doing ball games all the way back then. But one of the things that's the most curious about these is every single one of these things was intentionally buried. Some were partially uncovered over time, but every single one was intentionally buried. Now that's really puzzling, because this is basalt, and it's a very hard material, and it takes a lot of effort to make something like this. To go to the effort of making something this and burying it is really kind of puzzling. The other thing that makes it puzzling is that every single one of them is also mutilated in some way or the other. Not a single one of them doesn't have some damaging. Colossal head number 2 at San Lorenzo is perhaps the most damaged, but even this head has some damage on it. And the damage is made by taking a hammerstone and repeatedly hammering it until you get these kind of pock marks on it. So A, why would you make these things? And then B, why would you intentionally destroy them and then bury them? And there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to why or how they're buried. Some are buried on their back, some are buried on, upright. Some are buried in the platforms themselves, others are buried off the platforms. There doesn't seem to be any kind of logic or reason to the way these things are disposed of. If they were all in the center of a pyramid, then maybe you could argue, oh, and then there's obviously some kind of votive inside the pyramid, some kind of symbolic offering or sacrifice. But since they're all over the place, no one can really say. So what is our guess? Well, our guess here is that one of two possibilities. One, that they represent rulers and elites. That makes sense. The ball gear or the helmet or the headdress is probably evidence of someone who is of rank. And since they're very impressive monuments, that makes sense. That's what you're honoring here. They probably represent, they all were very individualistic. They have a lot of features in common, but they seem to be portraits. So if that's the case, then maybe they're the heads of deities and rulers. Why then are they buried? Well, maybe this dynasty fell out of favor. And once a dynasty fell out of favor, they just toppled them over, buried them, got rid of them, damaged them as a way of disempowering, the object. The object has some kind of vitality or life all its own, and so you kill it. The other possibility is that they were made to be buried. That seems counterintuitive to a modern perspective. We make art to be seen. But of course, if you're a religious people, you make art for the gods as an offering. And so it's possible that these are some kind of sacrificial victim, that they are being ritualistically killed and then buried. But one would think that they would be a little bit less haphazard in their placement if that was the case. So it remains a mystery. What we can say is that artistically about them, they are absolutely beautiful. They have an incredible high degree of naturalism. I love the details, getting things like the puckering of the flesh around the eyes, around here under the mouth. This is a real incredible attention to detail, and doing this in basalt, which is a kind of a glassy, hard rock, shows a great deal of skill. I also like that the sutures or seams on the lips are so, incredibly defined. And so that's one thing that really marks out Olmec art, is that it's very, very naturalistic. When we look at the human form, Olmecs have a very organic sense of the human form. They are clearly looking at human models and figures. I love this guy and his dad bod. This wonderful fold of flesh under his arm. I love the posture of the head resting on the chin. It's very naturalistic, both in the sense that this looks like a person who could have sat this way. I know the head looks a little elongated, but remember that they practiced head binding, so that's probably not a complete exaggeration. Elites had bound heads to show that they were elites. And so throughout Olmec imagery, we see this kind of attention to detail. Here we see this figure known as a wrestler. This one was uncovered on a roadside. And, again, he looks like he's got somebody in a headlock, like a luchador. But, no, he's probably wrapping some cloth around his middle, like a ball player. When you play ball in the ancient Mesoamerican world, you play with a solid rubber ball, not like the kind of hollow, inflated rubber balls that you played dodgeball with, but solid all the way to the center, solid rubber. You can imagine that could just take somebody's head off. So they wore a lot of protective gear, and so maybe that's what he's doing, is he's wrapping layers of cloth. And in the original, they probably used actual cloth to show this. But look at the dynamic action of him, how one shoulder lifts and the other one dips. One leg tucks under the other as he leans into the side. It has a high degree of naturalism. Now, I know that there's a controversy about this. Some people suggest this one's a forgery. I disagree. We have enough other naturalistic examples that are similar to suggest that, no, this is definitely within the wheelhouse of Olmecs, that they can do this. There's also a little bit of controversy in that he does have a pronounced mustache and beard. Now, mostly native inhabitants of the New World are hairless. They have hairless faces. But they do have some hair. There is some beard and some mustache. So this seems to be exaggerated. Again, this is a sign of virility or authority. So that's probably what's going on here. We see similar kind of elongated figures. This one is from an offering at La Venta. This was buried under a layer of packed white sand and is evidence again of this intentional burial. So these were obviously intentionally buried as some kind of offering. Maybe the heads were too. The figures here are carved out of a variety of very hard stones, greenstones, jades, etc., and they're accompanied by what we call celts. These are these things right here. Here is a photograph of this thing being excavated, and the celts are in fact ritual axe blades. Now, if you're going to chop, up flesh or things like that, flint, obsidian, great for flesh and bone and stuff like that. But if you're going to chop wood, you need a polished axe. And you make that out of something like jade or very hard greenstone. And so these are ceremonial axes. So we have a collection of figures here. Notice that they have that kind of elongated head, again, but these very curvilinear bodies. And the axe heads here are incised with what probably are representations of deities. So an intentional votive deposit. You bury these things, they become like sacrificial victims to the gods. One of the things that's right established from the very beginning in the Olmec period is that jade and greenstone are considered to be very, very valuable. In the Mesoamerican sphere, jade was valued above gold or silver or any other material. It was regarded as to kind of be a symbol of the life itself. And so the green, hard quality was evidence of life. Now, technically, if you're a geologist, only jadeite and nephrite are technically jade. But in the ancient world, they didn't care so much about those things. So a lot of these stones are chrysoprase or other varieties of stones that are just bright green stones. They didn't get into the geology or the mineralogy of it. They didn't care. They didn't know, as long as it was hard and dense and green. So that's why we sometimes call this jade and sometimes we call this greenstone. Not all of it is technically jade, but eh. And so we see jade figurines, and we also see jade masks. Notice that this mask has a cleft in the forehead, and also that it has this strange kind of snarling mouth. I'll explain why here in a bit. One of the things that we do see in Olmec iconography is jaguar imagery. We see this wonderful jaguar effigy where the tail is turned into the spout, and you have this pointing tongue and terrifying face. Same thing here with this sticking out tongue and terrifying face on this ceramic vessel. And that's because the jaguar is the apex predator of the Mesoamerican sphere. There's nothing out there that's scarier. It takes on caimans and crocodiles with no problem. The tongue really is rather pointy, and the teeth are pointy too. They're terrifying creatures. My brother-in-law was an archaeologist, and he actually worked on a dig where he had to walk the last few miles into camp, and he was shadowed, mirrored by a jaguar the whole time, and he just kind of kept the corner of his eye on it for fear that this might be his last walk ever. They are scary animals, bigger than mountain lions, and mountain lions around here are known for being man killers. So you can understand why this thing was so evocative for them, because this is such a charismatic animal. But notice that the animal does in fact have a kind of cleft in its forehead, and its nose is upturned, which explains these strange things. Now these are masks, and they were probably never ever worn in the way that we think of masks, over the face as a kind of performance. They were probably, generally they tend to be smaller than life size, and so they were probably emblems on a pectoral, or they were made for the deceased to be put over the face. But as we look at these, they're very clearly human. I mean, the ears are on the side of the head, and it has two eyes and the forward-looking face. But notice that the nose is upturned, and notice that we have this strange, prominent, snarling mouth. That's a jaguar mouth. This one does not have the upturned nose, but it definitely has the snarling mouth. But notice the cleft in the forehead. So we have a lot of these images that we call were-jaguars. These are images that are half human, half jaguar. And we even have these wonderful little figurines that have partially humanistic characteristics, partially animal or zoomorphic characteristics. So if you ever wanted to know how old anthro and furries are, very, very old. And these have always been interpreted as shamanistic transformations, some evidence that shaman believe that they have the power to turn into jaguars, or advocated that they did. And so these are artworks suggesting the midway transformation point. They're really quite beautiful and powerful. In the mix of these images, we have these very strange Were-Jaguar Infants. This is a ceremonial axe head, again. So many levels of symbolism here. First of all, it is in the shape of an axe head, but then carved into the axe head is this infant, which we can tell by the depiction that it's an infant, but it has one of these Were-Jaguar snarling faces. This is something that we see again and again in the artwork. Here is a votive offering of a more human figure holding a snarling Were-Jaguar baby. I don't know, this is like a lost book in the Twilight series. Anyhow, and here you can see, notice that the baby is holding on to what looks like a kilt, and is riding on the back of a jaguar, and has that jaguar-like face. This is such a common image in their artwork everywhere we go, that obviously this was some formative primal myth for them, that this is some mytho-historical figure that is essential to their belief, but exactly what, we can't tell. This figure, when it was discovered, was called the Las Limas Madonna, because it looked like a Madonna in child to them, but it's not a Madonna, it's actually a woman. It's actually not a woman, it's a man, excuse me. And you can see there is a man there, and he has an incised face, and he is holding in his lap another one of these Were-Jaguar babies. And then on each of his shoulders and on his knees, he has incised kind of jaguar imagery, and he has a jaguar imagery incised on his face. So this offering of a jaguar baby, this offering of the Were-Jaguar baby, seems to be such an important motif, and we really can't say much more than that. As I mentioned before, the Olmec are the first civilization in the New World, well, unless quipus turn out to be a fully formed writing system. Everything keeps changing. Darn archaeologists, I wish they'd stop digging. It makes it so hard to teach when you just keep coming up with new information. But we do have this thing, which Dr. Houston argued was probably the first evidence of writing. Now, how do we tell this is writing and not just pictographs? Or the difference between a pictograph and a writing system is that a pictograph are representational symbols. They do have meaning, but each symbol is unique and kind of created on the spot, or is borrowed from a long-standing, kind of vocabulary of what they mean. And they're not intended to be structured as sentences or words. Each symbol is a kind of a cue, a mnemonic device to help you kind of put the image and the concept of what you're looking at back together. So when you look at something like, say, by Fremont Indians, there's no evidence that Fremont Indians ever had a writing system, but they have these repeating symbols that happen all the time. So how do we know these repeating symbols are some kind of writing? Well, it's because of the way they're structured and ordered. We see the same symbols repeated over and over. We have the strange, is it a scorpion? Is it a lizard? We don't know. We see it repeated over and again. You can see a glyph which probably represents corn, repeated over and over again. We have glyphs that clearly represent bundles, repeated over and over again. And we have glyphs that represent thrones, repeated over and over again, or altars. So the repetition of themes, I mean, this glyph here, for example, you can see this is repeated several times. And the way these are organized into blocks, they're not just left alone. We see this is clearly a group meant to be read together. This is a group meant to be read together. This is evidence of writing. This is evidence that they're trying to create coherent sentences. What those actually are, no one can tell you. No one has ever translated this. But we can see in this the beginnings of what perhaps might become the very sophisticated Mayan system. And we also have at this time the very first dating systems and number systems. In this number system, a dot equals 1 and a bar equals 5. So this one you should be able to figure out. This is actually the number 16. This is the number 18 down here. And you can see here it is a little bit better. That's that section we're looking at right there. And this is probably the first historical date recorded in the New World. This one dates to late in the formative period. This is probably the year 31 BC. But it's found at Tres Zapotes in the Olmec zone, right at the tail end of Olmec civilization, where the last of these cultures are dying out in the Olmec sphere. This date actually corresponds to something we call the long count. Now, I'm not going to get into the long count here. I'll talk more about it when we talk about the Maya. But the long count is the system of counting known amongst the Maya. And it's this incredibly deep sense of time where you have cycles of years, and then you have cycles of, 20 years, etc. going on. And these build up to a very, very deep calendar system. And it's a universal calendar system. So this is evidence that some of the Mayan calendars actually date from the Olmec time period. And so perhaps that connects the two cultures together. We'll talk more about calendars when we get to the Maya. The other main monuments that we find in the Olmec zone are going to be these thrones or altars. We don't really know if they're thrones or altars. They could be both. Altars look like thrones because the king sits on a throne, and he himself is kind of like an offering to the gods. And the sacrifice kind of stands in for the king in a way. So they could be the same thing. When we look at them, we see figures emerging from caves, and we see a kind of hierarchy. This upper banding has this kind of terrifying face, like a jaguar face here, but then you see this banding, and anytime we see this kind of banding, that usually associates something with the sky. We call it sky banding or cloud banding. And so that indicates a kind of cosmology that seems similar to what we know of Mesoamerican cosmology from later civilizations, that you have the up, which is you have a series of levels in the afterlife that are towards the heavens, and then you have a series of levels that are below. I think in the Mictlan there's 9 levels to the underworld and 13 levels above. The numbers are a little different in the Mayan sphere in Xibalba. But whether we call it Mictlan, which is the Mexican word for it, or Xibalba, which is the Mayan word for it, it's all the same thing. This complex sense of the underworld. And here we have a god who seems to be coming out of a cave. Caves are often, entryways into the afterlife. And he's holding on to a piece of cloth that is then held by another person, indicating some kind of offering or, kind of ritual taking place. We see a lot of these kind of altars. Here on this altar, we have somebody again emerging from a cave, the underworld, and they are carrying one of these strange little creepy babies again. And even if you go to the side of this, you have 2 people carrying these strange creatures. Sometimes we call these infants, sometimes we call them dwarves. Dwarves are very common in the iconography because dwarves are seen as liminal figures. They can cross the boundaries between this world and the afterlife. Notice this one has a cleft head, so again, that kind of Were-Jaguar imagery. Perhaps one of the most important images for later time periods that come out is the so-called sky dragon. So when it's Olmec, we call it a sky dragon. When it's Mayan, we call it the feathered or plumed serpent, or Kukulkan. When it's in the Mexican basin, we call it Quetzalcoatl. It comes by many names, but it seems to be the same character. It's a little bit easier to see that we have a figure, possibly an ancestor, who is making an offering. He has a situla, a kind of bucket to make an offering. And he is riding on this snake that has a rattle, like a rattlesnake. And then it's this plumed serpent that has this crest coming off of its head and off of its eyes and its eyebrows. So this is probably one of the first representations of Kukulkan, or the plumed or feathered serpent. Evidence that this is some kind of rain or regenerative or maize deity that exists in their culture. But other than that, we really can't say much more about the Olmec. Speaking about Olmec contributions and continuity, we have evidence of bloodletting and sacrifice. There are jaguar, rain and maize deities, feathered serpent, sky dragon, early writing, numbers, calendar systems, pyramidal shrines, platforms, and some evidence of ball playing. All this comes together, seems to suggest that they are indeed the Ur culture, the mother culture of all the Mesoamerican cultures, because all of these are present at a very early date, several hundred years BCE, in the formative period, long before they show up in any other zone. So whether they are the ancestors of the Maya, or whether the Maya are merely borrowing things from them culturally because they revered this ancient civilization, who can say? If you look to Europe, for example, Latin became the language of the church and the language of education of a bunch of people who had no Latin roots at all. They were not Romans, they were in fact Germans. They spoke a completely different language, but they adopted the culture, they adopted Roman law and art and custom. So it's entirely possible that, just as those German barbarians moved in and adapted Catholicism in the church and Latin and all the other things, that the Maya may have been the same way. They may have been natives that saw this great culture and adopted all their culture, or they might actually be descendants. There's a number of promising genetic studies happening. We'll have to see how it turns out. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Monte Albán. This is down in Oaxaca, and we have a really incredible site there. It dates from the late formative, late pre-classic period, right up into the later classical period, right up to the year 900 CE. So many of the great monuments that we'll see here are actually quite late, but everything in the New World is like a Russian doll. You never tear down a pyramid or a complex, you just build a bigger pyramid on top of it, because that original pyramid is sacred, so you can't destroy it, but you can encase it. And so when we see these magnificent platforms and structures, these are all dating to the classic period, but because we've done some test trenches, we know there are some pre-classic monuments under every one of these, so it's quite an extensive ceremonial site. That gives us evidence that it's a very ancient site, and possibly one of the oldest ball courts in the Mesoamerican sphere. So this is the ball court. They're characteristically eye-shaped. So you have a long kind of, we would call it an end zone. I guess it's not an end zone. We don't know exactly how they were used. And this is the playing area in between. These, you might be tempted to think these are bleachers, but they're not. They're actually playing surfaces. They're places we would bounce the ball off of. And not far from here, we have a number of reliefs. And we're not entirely certain what the context of these reliefs are. We have figures with glyphs. The figures are called danzantes, or dancing figures. That may be accurate. They may be sacrificial victims, or they may be ball players. But notice how kind of organic and lively they are. That definitely does seem to fit more into the Olmec mode. So when we look at later Maya, the Maya are also going to have much more organic curvilinear figures. When we get up to the Mexican basin, the Mexican basin is going to be a lot more tightly designed, much more geometric figures. So maybe this is evidence of Olmec import. We don't know. And that brings us to Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan, the abode of the gods. So Teotihuacan is located right there. It is to the north of the modern-day Mexico City. Mexico City was built on the remnants of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec city when the conquistadors came. So Teotihuacan was already a ruin by Toltec times, let alone Aztec times. But it was a very impressive ruin, and the Aztecs and the Toltecs knew about it, and so they named it, and they called it Teotihuacan, which means the city of the gods, the abode of the gods, or the place of the gods. And so that's very appropriate, as you can imagine it. Teotihuacan is an interesting period because it overlaps this period between the pre-classic period and the classic period. It used to be that most people thought that it was kind of wrapped up by around 400, 450 CE. Now I think the latest thinking is that there was evidence that people were living there as late as 750 CE, which places it well into the classic period. But certainly its golden age is somewhere prior to 400 CE. So if there were people living there, it had long since ceased to be significant by that point. And there are also a lot of intercultural contacts between these cultures, the Maya and Teotihuacan. So we'll talk about those in a bit. So again, late formative to early classic, massive urban center. And this might be one of the few true cities in the Mesoamerican sphere. Let's talk a little bit about cities versus ceremonial centers. For most of the Mayan sites, and probably the Olmec sites and Zapotec sites, these aren't true cities. They don't have an urban fabric. What I mean by that is that there's not a lot of people living in these centers. They are centers for elites. They are ceremonial centers where villages from all around would send people to work, to build them, and to come to worship or maybe to trade. They would have marketplaces. But there's no evidence that there were large populations there. That may not be true for Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan may have been an actual city of 50 to 100,000 people. I think 100,000 is a bit high in estimates, but 50,000 seems easily doable. And you can see all of these little palaces, is what we call them, these little compounds, self-contained compounds, all around the entire city. It's really remarkable. So this thing may have been a true empire. Generally in the Mesoamerican sphere, we don't have empires. We have little city-states that exert influence over other city-states and conquer them, demand tribute, but don't bother to actually rule or set up a unified kingdom. But Teotihuacan may have been a unified kingdom for a few reasons. So we'll take a look at this. You have this massive urban center there. And when we look at the site, you can see it's really incredible. So here's the Pyramid of the Sun, which is the main monument. This is the Way of the Dead, and this is the Pyramid of the Moon, this plaza out front, sometimes known as the Viking Group. One of the things that makes us think that Teotihuacan may have been a true empire is that we find Teotihuacan trade goods all the way down into the Mayan sphere. Tripod vessels, which are these classic Teotihuacan vessels, start popping up in Mayan tombs. And we see two phenomena. We see items that are clearly trade items. You know, they are not just tripod vessels. They are clearly being made and manufactured in the Mexican Valley and brought all the way down to the Mayan region. Others are clearly made in the Mayan region, but they are modeled after these. So trade goods like this make us think that there must have been a strong connection. But there's also a few strange historical features. We'll talk about this more when we get to the Mayan zone. But down in Tikal, Stela 31, the Stela of Cihuachtlancawil, the second, Stormy Sky, fantastic name, tells the story of his ancestors. And his story is a complicated story. We have a figure who shows up, and his name is Smoking Frog, or at least we used to think his name was Smoking Frog. Now I think people think his name is Siwashka'ak, which is Born in Fire. But either way, Born in Fire, Smoking Frog, these are killer names. So if you have if you're pregnant and have a baby coming on the way, you know, consider these. These are fantastic names. And Siwashka'ak, or Smoking Frog, or Born in Fire, however you want to call him, doesn't appear to be Mayan. He comes from the north, and he appears to be a general from a guy called Spear Thrower Owl. And Spear Thrower Owl appears to be the ruler of Teotihuacan. We're not entirely certain, but that's who he appears. And when he first shows up on the scene, he's just there as a kind of bureaucrat from Teotihuacan, a diplomat or somebody to say hi. But within short order, he's in charge. And all the other references to all the other nobles are gone. And then he establishes a dynasty, and then Cihuachtlancawil is a descendant from him. So that suggests that Teotihuacan had the ability to put people on thrones in places like Tikal, all the way down here in Guatemala. So you have, you know, places down here that are being controlled from the Mexican basin. That's a lot of power. That's a lot of power and a lot of reach. That isn't just, you know, give us tribute or we'll kill you. This is something else entirely. So Teotihuacan may have been the only true empire in the Mesoamerican sphere. So when we look at Teotihuacan, it's important to note that for most of its history, people knew that it was there. It was a ruin. But it was unexcavated. Even in Aztec times, it was covered in rubble and vegetation. Here's a painting by Jose Maria Velasco, this wonderful landscape painter from the 19th century in Mexico. And as you can see, it was entirely covered. You'll notice that he paints the top of the Pyramid of the Sun as being rather pointy, but when you look at it today, it's not terribly pointy. So this site was under several massive restorations. Work began in earnest. This was one of the great monuments of Mesoamerican civilization, and for the 100th year anniversary of Mexican independence, they wanted to, you know, highlight their history. Now, this is like the third or fourth largest pyramid in the world by volume. It's not half as tall as like the pyramids at Giza, but it's more massive because it has a wider base. So they took it all off. Well, here's the thing about these pyramids. Remember, they're like Russian dolls. They're one nested inside the other. So the latest layer is going to be the most exposed to nature erosion. It's going to be the most damaged. And so then you have to make a decision. Do we strip off the most damaged layer to reveal the more preserved layer underneath? And if we do so, we destroy a lot of archaeological information. Or do we leave that intact? And so this is something that has happened many, many times in Mesoamerican archaeology. And I'm not here to badmouth Batros or Gamio, but they definitely had, you know, for the day, they were operating at the archaeological standards of the day, they had different priorities than we might. And even today, different countries have different priorities. Mexico loves tourism, and they also love their national identity. So they want these objects to be accessible to tourists. There's actually a good archaeological reason to restore these sites, because if you restore these sites, that keeps them from being damaged and looted further. And it also brings in tourist money, which means you have more money to kind of preserve things. Whereas if you go to Guatemala, Guatemala's theory is, okay, we'll let the archaeologists dig, and then we'll have them leave, and then we'll have no one go back to the site ever again. They don't want the sites developed because more tourism means more damage. And yes, it means more access, but you deal with the consequences of that. There's no one good solution here. There's trade-offs. But we do want you to be aware that when you're looking at these, you are looking at restorations. You're not looking at the originals. There is evidence that we may have lost something in the translation. Gamio specifically kind of tore down a lot of stuff because he found a better preserved, fancier pyramid underneath, and that's what he wanted to preserve. So the main monuments we're going to take a look at are going to be the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and an area down here known as the Citadel, and its main monument is this thing here, which is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, or Quetzalcoatl. So let's take a look at that. Notice again, that same form has always persisted that we saw in the Olmec region. We have a high platform with a platform on either side and a kind of open courtyard for performance in between. Now this one has a lower platform on this side to act as a kind of entryway, but still, that is a very, very old kind of plan. At the center of this we have outbuildings that are probably there to service priests and people who are attendants to the temple, and then we have the pyramid and temple itself on the top. So the pyramid today is in a very poor state of preservation, and Gamio noticed that at some point they built a large platform out here to the front of the temple, and doing so they covered up the front of the temple, which managed to preserve this section of the temple. So everything you're seeing here in this area is an excavation. He excavated that area right in here so that he could get to the surface of this temple that was covered up by that. There are also some current excavations that are ongoing. So this is that platform leading up to the temple, and again, it looks pretty clean, but remember this is restoration here. This is all modern restoration, most of it. And this is probably as good a place as any to talk about one of the principal features of Mesoamerican architecture. That's going to be the Talud and Tablero. So the Talud and the Tablero are these two parts of the pyramid structure. The Talud is this angled section, and the Tablero is this section here where you have a portion that juts out and then sunk back in a zone for decoration. And we think that this is meant to represent clouds. If you'll notice, this puts a shadow along the edge. So you ever seen clouds on a horizon? They're flat on the bottom and they have shadow edge on the bottom. And if you imagine the heavens as a tiered with multiple heavens, then maybe this represents the multiple layers of heavens going forward. There's more evidence to back this up when we look at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, because you'll notice that we have along here, we have these beautiful masks. This was the part that Gamio was so in love with that he just kind of excavated and got rid of everything on top of it just so he could see this section. And so here we see masks representing the deities of Quetzalcoatl, the Feathered Serpent, intermixed with heads of Tlaloc. And then we see serpents. And again, these are the sky serpents. And so you can see there as well. So that's a probably good indication that this represented clouds. Here's what this would have been reconstructed as. Again, this is not the latest date for this temple. There was a later period where they built a massive platform out here, and that's that platform that you see in front of this. But because that platform was built here, it preserved all of this decoration that was here. When we look at this decoration, you can see there is the rattle at the end of the serpent, and the serpent's body curves around until ultimately its head with this plumed mane sticks out. You can see that same kind of serpent head with a plume on its head right there, winding its way over the top. And then you see conch shells. Conch shells are, of course, from the ocean. They're symbols of life, vitality, water, and so these are all kind of emblems of sky, cloud, rain, rejuvenation, all of these things. And it creates this beautiful relief. Now, when you look at this god, you notice this god has some crazy goggles, and he looks like he's covered over in mosaic tiles. And this is a very characteristic representation of Tlaloc. Tlaloc is one of the chief deities here. And so the two deities here are paired, are Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc. And Tlaloc seems to be the chief god of war and chief god of Teotihuacan. He's usually personified as a god of rain and of floods. And Quetzalcoatl is also a god of rain, but he's god of rain in a different aspect. That he brings rains for, plants, rejuvenation, those kinds of things. So you have the positive and negative aspects of water combined here. And this is a very common feature of all Mesoamerican belief systems, is dualism. No god is singular. Every god has got a counterpart god that in a weird kind of way is that same god, but in a different incarnation. When you get to the Aztecs, some gods will have an incarnation based on time of day or on the four cardinal points of the compass. And so this is clear evidence that you have these dualistic entities that represent these things. So we see images of Tlaloc everywhere. You can always recognize Tlaloc by this kind of strange fanged face and these goggle-like eyes that exist. And so when we see this mask with these goggle eyes, which are supposed to represent jade goggles, that's probably who's meant to be represented here. Now, when this temple was built, they knew that there was a massive sacrifice underneath it to dedicate it. There had been a discovery of 137 skeletons, and these skeletons had necklaces made out of shell, and the shells were made to look like jawbones, human jawbones. And then there were also human jawbones. So evidence of mass sacrifice to dedicate this temple. But recently, Sergio Gomez, an archaeologist on the site, a sinkhole opened up in the early 2000s. And sinkholes mean there's a chamber or something underneath them. And so he excavated this entire shaft and uncovered these two cruciform chambers. And along this route, he found a whole area of, again, greenstone figures, jawbones, offerings of many different kinds. When we look at this, there are jade beads and, of course, evidence of human sacrifice. When we look at these figures, they have some of the characteristics of the greenstone figures that we saw amongst the Olmec. But remember what I said, they're far more, kind of regimented. They're sharp and angular and not nearly as geometric as the Olmec would make them. That brings us to the Pyramid of the Sun. So the Pyramid of the Sun is the oldest and the largest construction on the site. It's 61 meters tall. It's a colossal structure, and it was probably the tallest structure in North America until the 20th century. You have a whole series of levels on this, and the latest level seemed to have had only 4 tiers. We have a 5-tier pyramid, which suggests that Batra stripped off a lot of information. But, there's, again, it's a trade-off. And everything else on the site is oriented to this building. So it basically sets this east-west axis, and the pyramid faces the setting sun, and every other building on the complex is oriented then to this building. As we look at it, it is just a colossal structure. It has a single staircase that goes up the front that branches into 2 staircases that then goes up to a top. Now at the top there probably would have been a structure, perhaps a massive structure. It's been reconstructed a couple of different ways. The top is a little bit hard to get a handle on. Here's some beautiful reconstructions. I found these off of Molly Art's website, which unfortunately no longer exists, but they had these beautiful VR reconstructions, give you a real sense of what it would have looked like. Incredible sight. From the top of that, you can look out down the Avenue of the Dead out to the Pyramid of the Moon, which is vastly smaller, but still a colossal pyramid. So the Pyramid of the Moon is built after the Pyramid of the Sun. The latest iteration of the Pyramid of the Sun seems to have been built around the year 300 CE. And so this seems to use a construction type built around that time, where it uses partition walls and then it's filled in with rubble. So it's not like huge blocks of stone all the way through. It's mostly rubble with walls to kind of hold it in place, and then finished off with masonry on the outside. It has this massive courtyard with other kind of dedicatory temples as well. And it has this commanding view going out to the Way of the Dead and the avenue that heads this direction. Now, underneath the Pyramid of the Sun here, there was found a cave. And it was a naturally occurring cave, and there was a deposit found there. And that suggests that the entire site might be associated with the legend of Chicomostoc. The Toltecs and Aztecs venerated this site as a site of their ancestors. And if you know a little bit about Toltec and Aztec myth, you know that they have a series of migrations. They migrate from the north, from Aztlan, and then they stop at a place called Chicomostoc, which is the 7 caves, and then in those 7 caves come out one of the tribes that will be the Mexica. And so maybe this is the legendary site of Chicomostoc. We don't know. And perhaps that part of the temple where they build those cruciform caves is an attempt to emulate that lobed cave. Who knows? It's kind of puzzling in that regard. So as we look out onto the Avenue of the Dead, this thing is 130 feet wide, and it has at least 2 other layers underneath it. It has multiple layers as well, meaning that it isn't one straight flat road. It has several drops in elevation. And so you could think of it as a series of plazas that then drop down into lower places. On either side of the Way of the Dead, you'll notice all of these outbuildings. Some of them are shrines or temples built off of the site, but most of them are kind of self-contained compounds that we call palaces or residences. Most are built around open courtyards, and the courtyards are supported by columns that are covered in basalt that are carved in the figures of deities. These would have been covered in a thin layer of stucco and painted, and in fact, many of these buildings still have remnants of the original frescoes or wall paintings that existed around them. So they would have been just vibrant places. These were probably the houses of elites, and remember that in the world of elites, nobles and priests and priestesses are the same category. So these probably would have been compounds of families or sacred societies that would have supported specific cults. So not surprisingly, when we look at reconstructions of the paintings, such as this one here, this is probably evidence of a religious cult. This is the so-called water goddess or spider woman, so named because a spider descends on a thread through the center. But we have 2 enormous, what appear to be streams of intersecting water that have what appear to be either grasshoppers or butterflies and spiders, and the 2 streams end in flowers. And then we have birds, and you can tell the birds are singing because we have a little cloud or a kind of scroll representing their speech coming out of it. Here the water goddess is dripping what appears to be jade from its fingers, jade in the form of water or life emanating out. These figures are, again, they have their situlas, their buckets. These are probably priests, and they are spreading water, and coming off of the water are little jade amulets and other figures and flowers connecting jade and life. And then there's a cloud, again, filled with jade ornaments in there as well, showing a so close association with jade. And you can see all of these waves of water coming forth. Again, it's a pretty dry area, so water is very important. One of the reliefs, one of these frescoes shows a very interesting scene that's been interpreted as the paradise of Tlaloc. Again, Tlaloc is the god of water, but he's also the god of floods, the kind of dark aspect. Getting into the Mesoamerican afterlife is kind of a hard thing to do, and you basically can't get there unless you're a warrior, a noble, or an elite. If you're a woman that dies in childbirth, that's one way to get there. But one of the strange ways to get into the good afterlife is to be taken by drowning. So if you drown, that is believed to be evidence that you've been claimed by the god Tlaloc. And if you do so, then you go to Tlaloc's paradise. I guess there's got to be some reward for drowning. And so what you're seeing here are people tumbling into waters, presumably drowning. But then we have other figures that reach out to grab them, to pull them out. Here you can see this kind of sky banding, indicating that we are somewhere in the heavens. And then over here we have a bunch of people gambling about. We have acrobats and people performing. Notice that they are singing and speaking or enjoying a kind of paradise of Tlaloc. There's not a lot of large-scale sculpture on the site of Teotihuacan, but we do have this figure. Again, we're not certain who this character is. This was found near the Pyramid of the Moon and presumably represents the water goddess Chalchihuitlicue, but who knows for certain. She has a mantle like, Chalchihuitlicue, but it's more likely that this is a generic goddess or figure that we don't know, and may have acted as the pillar of a structure, or, because it's so square. But notice how square and blocky it is. It's another one of these things that really sets the Mexican basin away from, say, the Maya or the Aztecs. Some of the classic Teotihuacan artifacts are going to be these tripod vessels. Oftentimes these are not glazed, but they're covered in a thin layer of stucco. You can see how it's chipped off and then painted. So they're polychromed, but they're not fired like a glaze. They have these characteristic tripod feet, and these would have been used for a variety of purposes, for burning incense and a whole variety of other things. They show images of deities. In this case, again, we're probably showing an image of Tlaloc himself. We also find stone masks. Stone masks, again, hard stone, much like the Olmec, but in this case the mask has been decorated in coral and in turquoise. Again, another way to show this incredible wealth and power. Turquoise, again, being a kind of a greenstone representing life. Well, that will close out Teotihuacan. We'll close out our early classic cultures, and we'll move on to the Maya for the next lecture. Thanks so much. See you next time.